12:01, so I'll go ahead and get us started. Hello again, everyone. Happy Love Data Week again. It's still Love Data Week. We're still excited about it. Whether you've been here for every session so far this week or this is your first time joining us, welcome. We're thrilled you've chosen to join us for our final installment of our inaugural Love Data Week speaker series. Our theme this year has been Spotlight on Open, and we've now put the spotlight on our 4 experts who work with open data with coffee chats throughout the week. Today, we've asked those speakers to come back and join us for a panel discussion on some broader questions about open data and their work in general. And to how they work with it and how they collaborate with others who work with it. So excited to pose some questions to them today. A few housekeeping items again to kick us off. This session is being recorded and captioning is available. You will be sent a link to the recording once it's been processed and uploaded. That can sometimes take us 1 to 2 weeks. Be patient, we will get you the link. Please keep your microphones muted throughout so we can make it easy on our captioner. However, we really want you to participate in the chat, ask us questions, raise discussion points. We'd love to hear from you, and I'm going to be prompting you for some input as well throughout the session. I'll be keeping an eye on the chat. So if you do have like a follow-up question for someone, put it in the chat and I'll try to get it to them at a reasonable time throughout the session. This webinar series has been hosted by the Research Data Management Working Group of the Network of the National Library of Medicine, which is an outreach and engagement arm for the National Library of Medicine. We provide free training, funding opportunities, and more nationwide. You can learn more about us at nnlm.gov. And as a companion to our speaker series, you've probably heard me mention it before, but we've developed a 23 things about open data list. So these are fun tips, resources, and more that can help you learn more about open data and its uses. You can download that PDF from the course pages for either our coffee talks or for the panel discussion today. And I'll drop those links in the chat for you. The slides from our previous coffee chats are also available for download from the coffee chat course page. So let me go ahead, I'll put those in the chat for you now. And finally, I do want to mention that today's session does offer 1 MLA CE, so I'll be sharing the evaluation link to claim that CE in the chat towards the end of the session. If you miss it for some reason, no problem, just send me an email and I will send you that link. So now let's get to the reason why you all came here today, our panelists. So I'm going to briefly introduce each of our panelists and then we'll jump into the discussion. So Ibraheem Ali is the Sciences Data Librarian at UCLA. Ibraheem holds a PhD in biomedical sciences, and after a brief postdoc, he transitioned into his role as a data librarian at UCLA. In his work, he explores issues of knowledge accessibility, data science training, research ethics, and their various intersections. On Monday, Ibraheem talked with us about how he's worked to map research data training and services at UCLA to better understand how and where students and faculty are accessing these services and how this process could be improved. He also presented the Institute for Quantitative and Computational Biology at UCLA as an example of a group that's used open data and an interdisciplinary collaborative approach to develop research data trainings and resources. He also provided some great tips for how to apply open science principles to instructional development and implement some of these concepts in your own work environments. Next up, we have Bob Gradeck. He manages and co-founded the Western Pennsylvania Regional Data Center, or WPRDC, at the University of Pittsburgh's University Center for Social and Urban Research. Launched in 2015, the WPRDC is a unique open data partnership between the university, Allegheny County, and the city of Pittsburgh. On Tuesday, Bob shared with us how the WPRDC, which builds tools to share data and maintains an open data infrastructure utilized by over 20 publishers, has been partnering with local organizations like the Black Equity Coalition and the Neighborhood Resilience Project to better understand the COVID-19 pandemic and responses to it on a local level. These partnerships have resulted in the investigation of important questions about viral spread patterns, communities and populations most affected, and the equitability of testing and vaccine access. Bob's also a member of the Civic Switchboard Project, which is an effort dedicated to helping libraries and library workers become participants in civic data initiatives. Next up, we have Yasmeen Shorish, and she is an associate professor and the head of scholarly communications at James Madison University Libraries. Her research focuses on changes in scholarly communication, data ethics and privacy, and issues related to representation. On Wednesday, Yasmeen led us in a really thought-provoking discussion about the relationship between open data and scholarly communication, grounded in the important idea that data is in fact a scholarly product. Audience members shared how open data is discussed at their institution, and we had a wide range of responses from, well, we barely mention it, to all data we produce is required to be made open, and it's sort of, a fundamental tenet of our institution. So Yasmeen helped us think about how data can promote equity. For example, if data sets are openly available, assuming they're appropriately fair or findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, they can be used by researchers anywhere. She also talked with us about situations in which data openness can actually kind of have the opposite effect. For instance, when communities may be hesitant or unwilling to participate in research, where the resultant data will be made open due to a history of marginalization by the research community or cultural norms around information sharing. And finally, Lisa Federer is the Data Science and Open Science Librarian at the National Library of Medicine, where she focuses on efforts to support workforce development and enhance capacity in the biomedical research and library communities for data science and open science. Lisa's also the editor of the Medical Library Association Guide to Data Management for Librarians. Yesterday, Lisa talked about how the NIH data sharing policies and some of the research she's done into how open data sets in the biomedical sphere are shared and reused. Some interesting key points were that data sets in different topical areas are utilized differently. Clinical data sets are reused in ways more similar to the original research topic than genomic data sets are. Data set reuse is highest among established researchers, but I learned this because I asked a question about it. Part of this may be due to repository policies that tend to require PIs to make data requests as opposed to younger researchers. And finally, data set reuse is not evenly distributed globally, and high rates of data set reuse soon after that data set is made available can be predictive of ongoing high request rates for that data into the future. These findings have implications for the application of the FAIR principles. For example, improved documentation, especially in non-English languages, might increase reuse of data around the globe. So let's see, I'm going to stop my sharing. And panelists, thank you so much for agreeing to my perhaps harebrained scheme of asking you to come to 2 talks in 1 week on pretty short notice during a week that's already really busy for you. I can't express how appreciative we are of you taking the time to join us. We've already learned so much from you, but now it's time to pick your brains even more. So I'm going to start us off with some questions for all of you. Audience members, I really want to invite you to share your comments, follow-up questions, other questions in the chat at any time, and I'll do my best to share those with the panelists. So our first question. During my introduction, I specifically made the point to not talk too much about each of your backgrounds, just sort of where you are now. Many of us, especially in librarianship, have come to the profession from other fields. I used to be an archaeologist. And so we end up applying skills from our backgrounds in creative ways. And likewise, I think a lot of folks who end up working with data maybe didn't necessarily expect to be doing that from the start. So could each of you tell us a little bit about the paths you've taken to get to the work you're doing today, and how you've been able to make adjustments along your career path to apply your other skills to working with data? Ibraheem, we'll start with you, and if anyone in the audience has an interesting story to share about how they came to be working with data, we'd love to hear those as well, so please do share in the chat. All right, over to you.
Awesome, thank you. So my background, as Kelsey mentioned earlier, is I'm originally from Fresno, California. I got my bachelor's in biology at Fresno State University. So I came from a very the Cal State system, maybe. So currently at UCLA, and I went to grad school at UCSF. studying immunology and virology and epigenetics and chromatin. So I went from an institution that didn't have a lot of resources to an institution with like a very vast abundance of resources. And so seeing that transition from of access and also just cost to access for an institution like CSU Fresno, it was expensive actually to access some of the things that that I had access to at UCSF and now at UCLA. So kind of along the question of how did I start working with data, kind of seeing this separation in who has access to what information, but also working as a researcher, we would do experiments that would cost $10,000–$15,000, and the data from the experiment would just sit on a hard drive, and it would sit on a hard drive for 8 to 10 years, and sometimes it even got lost. And so the fact that you know, resources can be spent in a particular way and then data could just be lost really really opened my eyes to the importance of sharing information and kind of making sure that people have access to the content that's generated by research labs. And so as I navigated graduate school throughout my PhD and then into my postdoc, I kind of saw, I learned about a variety of issues when it comes to scientific publishing and kind of the limitations and opportunities that that kind of emerge in the current system. And I got very, very involved in preprints, using data repositories to archive information, and kind of through really a random series of events, I found this position at UCLA, and I thought I'd take my shot, and then I've been here for the last 2 years, and it's been a really great opportunity to kind of bring a fresh pair of eyes to the UCLA library, in a sense, to kind of see like how do we deliver data services training, and how do we make sure that everyone at the institution gets a reasonable shot at access to this training. So I think I'll stop there and pass it on to Bob.
Yeah, so thanks. So my background's really different. I went and got a degree in city planning. After Pitt, I went down to Georgia Tech and went through the master's program in city planning. And when I was there, this was like early mid-90s, we were doing a lot of work in the city of Atlanta. And I was part of a shop that was just there to support a project called the Atlanta Project that was kind of an anti-poverty initiative. So you had grad students working with computers and civic information and just ready to help people involved with this, whether they were community organizers or kind of people overall planning this. And sitting in a room with everybody, we just realized we weren't getting asked the kind of questions that we were able to answer. People would come in and ask for a map of streets, but it was like really frustrating. And that led me to think, maybe there's a role here in helping kind of be an intermediary to say, hey, let me be part of your project and work with you with this data. So we were working with census data and you know, doing all sorts of stuff with parcel data that was pretty new to a lot of people. After that, I came back home to Pittsburgh and just started working, you know, in the area of community development strategy and economic development strategy at a sort of university think tank, but started getting more and more questions about, like, you know, what was happening in different neighborhoods around vacant property. And I found that, like, I was somebody who could answer a lot of the questions of, like, how many were there, where were they, and started to kind of expand that work back into the work that I was doing 10 years earlier in grad school, just with civic data and parcel data and neighborhood information. And it was really interesting, but it was also not able to do it at scale. And so as open data started to become a thing around the country, like with Pittsburgh is typical, things are always a couple of years behind. We were able to actually, like, prepare for open data to suggest a different model to say, hey, why don't we take the work that we've been doing as this civic data intermediary that we build trust with a lot of people and lots of government. Don't just publish data to a repository. Why don't you trust us to be part of that process, to manage the data, to pull in other organizations and build this inclusive infrastructure so that as people have questions in the community, we can kind of help them answer them. We can come to you, local government partners, for information, and we can kind of make that infrastructure available to everybody. So that's kind of how I came about it. So through that work, I've gotten so much more in line with what librarians and librarianship is all about with data, and have benefited so much from everybody at Pitt's Digital Scholarship Services team that we partner with now on the Civic Switchboard Initiative. The university's metadata librarian was instrumental in helping us not make mistakes that we could have easily made at the outset. So I've kind of like almost think of myself as like a library adjacent person. It's pretty cool.
So yeah, also a very different sort of pathway as to be expected. I suppose this is a second career for me as well. I spent about a decade in event production industry in Chicago. So that's different than librarianship in pretty much every way. Sometimes it feels like, except that I had to talk to a lot of different stakeholders. I was our union liaison, so I was coming from a non-union shop and working in a union city with union venues, and being able to speak across stakeholders and constituent groups that have very different priorities, very strongly held priorities, and come to a place where we could all move forward together, I think has been a skill that I've leveraged a lot in my roles in librarianship. So I've had, I worked at the health science library in grad school, and then as a science librarian, and then a data librarian, and now I'm in scholarly communication. And my daughter is hitting me in the back of the head, so that's cool. And now she's also talking to me. And all of those things, we have to kind of meet people where they are and see what their priorities are and how we can come to a place that meets all those priorities at the same time. And I'll talk to you in just a minute. And yeah, okay. And so now in scholarly communication, I've really gotten to where I'm at a lot through work I've done through ACRL, actually, started out as a digital curation interest group and turned into a digital scholarship section. And then I chaired the Research and Scholarly Environments Committee, which is one of the goal setting committees for the association. And I think just being able to learn a lot from colleagues and things that people are doing across the globe has been really informative, and just kind of constantly learning. So sorry for all those interruptions and tangents. Of course, she only comes when I'm actually supposed to be speaking. And I'll turn it over to Lisa.
My dog is the same way. Somehow she knows like when not only I'm on a call, but like an important call. I also have like sort of an unlikely background. I originally got my master's degree in English, and I spent about 8 years as an adjunct professor of English. And, you know, unfortunately, that is not a very sustainable career, being an adjunct. And so I ended up going back to library school with an interest in working in archives. And I quickly found out that I was really interested in medical librarianship. So I ended up working at the UCLA Biomedical Library, where Ibraheem is, I think, after I graduated, and got really interested in working with data. The National Library of Medicine was giving out supplements for research teams that had R01 grants to add an informationist to their team. And I was very lucky to be one of the first cohort to do that. And having that opportunity to work really closely with that research team was very informative. And it was something that I really enjoyed and knew that I really wanted to pursue. So I ended up taking a position at the NIH library, which is the library for the intramural researchers on, well, there are several campuses, but primarily in Bethesda, Maryland, and started their research data services program. And was there for several years before moving over to NLM. And in the meantime, got a PhD in information science because I also have a passion for research. So it's interesting, I think, as well to go through that experience of getting a PhD, because you really get a feel for the data problems that people are facing. So that's a little bit about me.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone. It's really interesting to hear about everyone's different paths. Lisa, I had no idea that you had an English background. That's really interesting. And sort of how those have contributed to and informed the work you're doing today. So my next question is a little bit less about data or you specifically and more about sort of work and how you work in general. So the question is, how do you make a project happen when you see an opportunity? It's kind of open-ended, right? I think Bob will start this one off, and I think he'll be a great example because I think his work with local organizations in response to the COVID pandemic is probably going to be a really good example for this question.
Yeah, I think, a lot of the work that we do, it really depends on relationships and trust that we've already built. So that's just like one of those things that it's really important to have. So we're not always starting from scratch every time. But with us, it's just about listening and being out there and being a part of the community and just being available for people. So we do office hours, we get invited to meetings and we show up. And I'm one of a team of 4 people that are part of the project. So we will go and we will engage and we'll listen and we'll just try to like offer advice. And it always helps if we have, since we're soft money at our center, if we have some resources available to do that. So it's, in some cases, it might start with a proposal that we jointly pitch, or we might just get out there and just start working and figure out how to fill that in down the road. But it's really all about just, with civic data work, just listening, whether it's people at the university that want to use data or community members that really need help with something, and offering help in different ways. It could be helping to get data and collect it and curate it and share it. It could be building tools. It could be just training technical assistants or data literacy workshops. So it's just like being responsive and being able to rely on your skill sets and your team member strengths.
We're going up, this is the order, right, Kelsey? I think one thing that I've observed, especially being in academia, is there's a lot of, I wonder what people kind of like wonder out loud about a thing, and then it just hangs in the air. And I find that I just go like, well, why don't we just do it then? Like, why don't we just try it? I mean, if it's something that you can do without needing a lot of resourcing, something that you can even just start doing a bit of, right? And then show that it doesn't immediately hit a wall. Like, oh, maybe we actually can go forward. Okay, well, now we actually maybe need some time from somebody to help with this, or maybe it would be helpful if we could access some new resource or something like that. Then you have to involve more people for a conversation. But sometimes the small number of people who are interested in something can create a lot more rapid investigation process, and then you can bring in more. So it's good. It's always, like Bob saying, the relationship, like reliant on relationships and relationship building, and not being afraid to like go into a new area and see what happens. I think that's been something that's been really successful for me.
Yeah, so I think I would build on that. I completely agree. And I think it's important to not be afraid to fail. And, know that, maybe not everything that you try is going to work out the first time, but see how you can learn from what did or didn't work. And I think, having sort of, I guess, like a sense of entrepreneurship, being willing to sort of, try some bold ideas, pitch some things, have, some data to back up what you're proposing can be really helpful.
Yeah, and just kind of echoing and agreeing with everything that's been shared already. Relationship building is super, super crucial. For me, it's like a lot of, I was kind of thinking of it as like being relentless in terms of like just checking in, like how you doing, what kinds of issues are you dealing with, especially with data. Every kind of discipline has a different subset of issues that they're working with. And as we think about like how to get everybody to work together, which like I feel like doesn't always happen from campus to campus, a lot of it is just like, yeah, checking in, bringing up ideas. I kind of think of it as like I throw out a bunch of marbles and then they'll all take the path of least resistance. And so it's like a lot of ideation, a lot of idea generation, and just trying stuff. Like things won't work, I know it, but like one thing will catch, and then someone, you know, this idea over here that I pitched to, I don't know, social sciences looks like a good idea to the biomedical people. So like we just kind of move things around, and so kind of like being patient, just being ready for any idea that you create to kind of fit within that path of least resistance with the people that you're working with.
I have a bit of a follow-up question, and any one of you can feel free to answer. So I think something that you all talked about was building relationships and relying on relationships that you have. So I guess my question is, how do you go about building those relationships, and especially in the sense of perhaps relationships with folks who maybe don't know much about working with open data, or they're skeptical? How do you sort of convince them? How do you build those relationships to get them involved?
Well, I would say one thing is getting out of the library, like really going to where people are, because I think, you know, unfortunately, we are still at a point where most people don't really know that libraries have data services and that librarians have this kind of expertise. So it does take a little extra effort to like really put yourself out there. And, you know, so when I first got to NIH, I was like constantly going to talks and like just kind of like striking up conversations with people, which as a bit of an introvert was sort of uncomfortable, but it really paid off in the end because I made some great contacts that way.
Yeah, totally agree. Definitely not an introvert, so I was very happy to like leave my office and be like, there's coffee and a seminar. But I also say, as far as getting people to think about open data and think about working with data in ways, sometimes it's a real slow burn, especially if they're very accustomed to their process and their habits. I just kind of, if I see something, like if I saw an article that reminded me of research that somebody was doing, I would just send it to them. I'd be like, hey, I saw this and thought of you, which is like the nerdiest sort of like thinking of you card. But I do that, and then they kind of were like, oh, she's kind of paying attention to like what we're doing over here, what we're trying to do. And so, I mean, like, sometimes years, you know, 2 or 3 years go by and somebody's like, so when you were talking about this data repository, I'm like, excellent. So that's how it's worked for me.
Oh yeah, I was gonna say, we don't talk like lead with open data because that can be a scary thing for people. We just talk about problems and how to solve them, and maybe like a little bit of creative brainstorming about how data could help. And a lot of it too is like a gift economy with us, where we will just do things and people will do things back for us because we did them a favor. So that kind of builds up as well. So you just have to kind of do the work to get to the actual work that you want to do.
Yeah, I definitely agree with a lot of what's been said. A little bit of the definitely not leading with open data, but really leading with like, what issues are you dealing with, and how do we try to figure out how to solve those issues? And often when you're working with data intensive fields, they have a lot of data problems, and they happen to be resolved by some useful open data infrastructure, that a lot of which exists, you know, in open settings, and at least we have access to within our institution. So yeah, but patience, that slow burn that Yasmeen mentioned, is super crucial. Just kind of bringing up ideas as they come up. Most of the time, especially the first few times you're meeting with groups, like sometimes they'll just either ignore the ideas, or just like, you know, it's just not particularly relevant at the time. And then as soon as they run into that issue, like from time to time, you'll get that person who's like, hey, you mentioned this. Can you talk a little bit more about it? And I find a lot of my consultations come in that way, where it's like I brought something up during a seminar that I showed up to, and then someone kind of follows up, you know, weeks or months later, and it's like, oh yeah, you were talking about that. So yeah.
It sounds like the tip is plant the seeds early and then help them grow over time and be very patient. Awesome. So I think while we're on the topic of, you know, collaboration and building relationships, another question kind of along the same lines as the previous one. So there's this sort of common and probably true saying that data science is a team sport. And we certainly see that when we look at how researchers are sharing and reusing open data globally. So the question is, how do you work with a team to make data projects successful? This could be your local coworkers, a larger national or international network of colleagues, or global system of researchers in general. Let's start with Yasmeen on this one.
Yeah, it's almost hard to answer because like everything relies on working with a team. But I try to think again about those relationships and where people have interests and expertise and do that bridge building. I feel like a lot of my role, especially around things with data science on our campus, which is sort of like just beginning to grow, is a bridge builder. And it's a bridge builder for people who on our campus are trying to maybe learn maybe they're trying to learn a new technique, or they're trying to set up a new curriculum to get them connected with larger organizations. So one of the organizations I shared information about is the Academic Data Science Alliance, and they're doing a lot of work in this area. So I'll say, well, have you seen this webinar about this, or have you gone to their leadership summit and seen these posters or something like that? And try to make those connections, and then we can start having a conversation across maybe a disciplinary expert. And it's just sort of like, it is about team building, not like the trust fall team building thing, but like building a group of people to work together based off of their areas of expertise and interest, where they might not have ever had a conversation with one another otherwise, because data science is sort of this like amorphous mess of a discipline that relies on like technical knowledge and deep disciplinary expertise and has no standards. So that means that you can do a lot with it, and you don't need to feel constrained really by what's been done before, because no one's doing it right.
Yeah, I think it's definitely good to recognize that a lot of people are not doing things right, and they're kind of just going along the best they can. But I think understanding and being able to communicate your own expertise is really important. I think when I was first starting out, I often felt a lot of like imposter syndrome, like, okay, these are like these top scientists, like, what do I know? But there's really a lot, I think, that that librarians have to offer. And so I think, you know, again, being able to communicate what that expertise is, and, you know, feeling confident in your ability to contribute to the team, because, you know, we do have really unique expertise that is super important and can really contribute a lot to teams.
Yeah, I'll very much echo that sentiment. Kind of the more time I spent in the library, I mean, coming in from a research background, I like being in the library. The more time I spent in the library, the more I realized, like, dang, a lot of these researchers need to be paying attention to some of these things, especially when it comes to like accessing and managing information. Like, it like now that I'm here, it makes so much sense. But yeah, with regard to working with a team, I think definitely leveraging kind of everyone's expertise is super crucial, because like knowing that, yes, you do bring like important aspects to the space as a librarian, but also the researchers can use some of their like connections and expertise as well to kind of help push projects forward. And I don't know, for me, as soon as I find like that one or two people that are interested, suddenly the kind of ball starts rolling faster and faster, and projects can really get a move on. So like working with people is absolutely crucial, and like helping out where you can. Like if you have like an hour to give for like a side project, I'm thinking like the gift economy that Bob mentioned earlier. Like if you can help out a little bit over here, then like you start to build a little bit more of that relationship, a little bit more of that trust, and a little bit more of that demonstration of your skill sets, so that then people can see like, okay, this is someone who I can rely on for X, Y, and Z things. And then like we can push forward with that. So yeah.
Yeah, I agree with all that. I think the one thing that we didn't talk about, just at least with the work that we do, with people looking to use civic information, it's, the people that are looking to use it for data science and other things are like a couple of degrees removed from the source and the creator, but we have those relationships. And I think when people are doing that work, it's going to be much better if they have that context of where the data came from and that whole setting that it was created in. And so that's one of those things that I think we think is a role for us. We may not be able to tell them what techniques or software to use, but we can at least say, hey, did you know that these are some of the things around this data that you need to understand before you start to really get into the work? And can we set up a conversation with you and the data steward? Those are the kind of things that we do with data science work.
I do want to just hop on something Lisa said, which is like the modesty of librarians when working with researchers or working in the research community, which is a generalization, but it is something that I've observed a lot. And I'll just say, like, game recognizes game, right? And so if you go in there, you are experts and you speak with the authority that you have in your expertise. Other researchers are like, oh, this person knows what they're talking about. And then, you can have a fruitful conversation. So I really am a strong advocate for that kind of approach as appropriate, rather than preemptively adopting a pseudo-deferential sort of posture. I think does a disservice to you and the expertise of the library too.
I think that's great advice, Yasmeen, and something I'm always trying to work on myself. So these last few questions, we've been sort of taking a really high-level view of things, and I want to dive a little bit deeper back into talking about working with data and tools and techniques and things like that. So for our next section, so our 23 things list, which I mentioned, has some tips and tools and resources on it. So let's build on that and talk about some skills and resources that you make use of in your work. Obviously, open data is a very broad field. It's rapidly changing and evolving. I'm personally sort of just starting to get involved. I was really excited recently. I got to take a library carpentries course and learn some basics of R. And I was so excited about it. I was really intimidated going into it. And I was like, I don't know, mathy type things, but it was like super fun and intuitive. So I'd love to hear what skills are you working on learning right now, or what tool is new to you and you're becoming familiar with it. Lisa, we'll start with you.
Yeah, so I'm excited for you that you're excited about R, because I'm a big R person. And I think that learning R was really it was sort of a game changer in my career, because it really gave me a lot of opportunities, and it really made me very useful to the research community at NIH, because there really wasn't anyone teaching R. And so I think I really was able to fill a big gap there. But now my sort of next project is I've decided I should learn Python so I can be bilingual. So I have been taking some of the time that we're all at home and doing some MOOCs, some online courses to get a little bit of expertise in Python, which is interesting. I sort of think of it as if you already spoke French and you want to learn Spanish, like they're just similar enough that you can kind of trick yourself into thinking that you know what you're talking about, and then like really mess yourself up. So it's been interesting to try and expand my programming toolkit.
So funnily enough, I was thinking the same thing. So my background also at this point is with R. I've been teaching R quite a bit, and I wanted to learn a little bit more of Python. So I would say that that's one of the avenues that I was going to go into. But I think instead of talking about that, I'll bring up that one of the things that I've kind of wanted to learn a lot more about is just pedagogical strategies and just teaching strategies. Like, how do people learn, and how do we make sure that, like, when they're learning all this information and like learning R and Python and like these languages is not easy, and a lot of times it's just not even fun. And so, like, because there's like so much hacking errors, like typos, all these little like tiny little things that can turn into headaches. And so how do we make that as easy as possible for people to navigate? And so that's kind of one of the projects that I've been thinking a lot about and trying to learn more about, because I think that, in that scheme of like, how do we help people learn, like that's kind of I don't know where I kind of see myself going for the short term.
Yeah, and that's one of those things that we're trying to learn too, is just like how to design learning opportunities and workshops, and especially virtually, like how do we do that? So we've done that with a lot of data literacy work. I just don't have time to like get too involved in more technical things in software these days. It seems like I'm just going to meetings and stuck in email. So for me, it's more of like, what are project management techniques that I should know, fundraising, how to go about that, and just kind of knowing enough about what everybody else needs in their work as part of our team is kind of like where I am. So I've moved away from like being the guy who works with the data to being the person who just goes to the meetings and tries to cover for everybody else.
I'll say that I definitely have done some learning of R and did some learning of Python and using Jupyter notebooks, you know, for trying to get into like what digital humanists need and, you know, different tools for that stuff. And that's fine, but I don't do it enough. Like, so every time I open up RStudio, I'm like, oh, okay, am I loading? Like, where are the libraries? Because I'm not a researcher doing it on the regular, right? So it's good in that I have some ability to like speak, you know, cogently to researchers about things and recognize when a tool might be helpful for them. But right now, what I'm really doing more skill building and I guess knowledge building really around is concepts around like epistemological justice, right? So understanding different ways of knowing and how those ways present across different fields and in different cultures, and sort of what's been lost in our current standardized ways of knowing, right, or colonial ways of knowing, and bringing that into the research frame, which certainly is a smoother conversation in some disciplines, in some of the social science disciplines or humanities disciplines, and kind of gets wedged in to more of the medical and STEM disciplines, even though it's like super relevant there. So that is definitely a area that I'm trying to expand and integrate more, not just for myself, but in my practice with others.
Then we had a couple inputs in the chat that I wanted to share with you as well. Mike says he agrees with Ibraheem. He's been really pushing for more education and training on how to present and communicate about data, which is really interesting, I think. And then Patricia has this great comment. She says, because of accessibility issues, I've been very interested in the potential for data sonification to extend the power of data visualizations to new audiences, and also 3D printing for tactile data representation. That is so fascinating. I would love to learn more about that. Patricia, if you have like a link or a resource or something that you would want to share in the chat with folks about either of those topics, please do that, because I would love to read it, and I'm sure everyone else would too. Thank you for sharing, folks. Along the same lines, what is, if you had to choose, what's the one tool or skill or technique that you're just so glad you learned and that you have at your disposal that makes your life working with open data easier? And what's the one thing you'd recommend everyone know how to do? Ibraheem, we'll start with you this time.
So I would say that for me, like the most transformative thing, especially working with researchers, working with data, because I do a lot of consultations, it was learning R. But I think I don't want to go in that direction, and I want to do something maybe a little bit different, which is probably the most useful skill that I've ever kind of picked up along my career path is public speaking, and like being comfortable talking in front of people in general. And I think the most kind of effective I've been in like various situations, especially setting up new partnerships or like kind of exploring these spaces. And I remember, or Yasmeen mentioned earlier, like just going to seminars and things like that is one way of doing those things. I kind of, when I first started at UCLA, I not only started attending seminars, but as soon as a research seminar had an opening, they were like, oh, we're looking for speakers. I'm like, library's going to talk. And I think that was huge because like suddenly they're like, oh wait, you know, librarians, they know about these things. And I think, and I mean, many people who are, you know, medical librarians at some point, if they're working with a medical space, or like, you know, the disciplinary librarians, you know what you're talking about. And so, and researchers will pick up on that. And so I think that, like, yeah, going back to like that one most useful skill, it's just that being comfortable speaking in front of people, and like just being able to like hold a debate. Like a lot of the researchers, since they're like, I don't want to deal with this, it's changing up my workflow, you can show to them like, look, you have all these problems, like my workflow helps resolve your problems. And that, I think, is probably like how I've been able to develop some of the relationships with labs kind of the best.
Yeah, and I think along those lines, like all the skills that I use the most and they're most valuable for me are just not technical. They're more about listening to people when they're talking about a problem, helping them scope a problem, and thinking creatively about data so that you can go and make a data request with, you know, with those kind of things in mind. So like from my standpoint, where I am right now in my career, it's all about just like being able to kind of pull all the pieces together and not so much having to do the work, because that's kind of what our team is really good at, is the technical aspects of that. But I can at least set the stage for that data request, or help people to explain their problem in a way that is relevant to people that have data and the skills.
I'll say, I'll give a technical answer, which is open refine. It's super handy for like lots of different things. That's good, and carpentries has some nice lessons around that. So that's my technical answer, and then I'm going to give like Ibraheem an alternative, which is speak plainly. I find just speaking really directly and plainly, generally, has been really successful in building bridges and finding points of common ground. So just don't hold the fact that I said epistemological justice earlier against me. I'm really excited because I learned how to say the word recently, but like it just cuts through sort of like the academic noise and fluff that sometimes fills a room.
So I'll pick up on this technical piece as well, because my answer to the question would be that I think like learning R has been the most, I mean, like I said earlier, I think that was a game changer, and I use R for like everything. I used it when I was doing my research. I have probably trained at this point, like probably close to 1,000 scientists on how to use R. And I like, you know, I even used it to build a Spotify playlist that like analyzed my music and found the music that was like the right tempo for me to go running. And so it's like, you can do all sorts of stuff with it, but I don't think that you have to know it, or Python or any of these other programming languages, to be successful in doing data work as a librarian. So like, I don't want to intimidate people and make them think that like, oh, I have to like go and get a PhD or learn how to program, because there's really a lot that librarians can offer without those you know, more technical pieces. And I think something Yasmeen said earlier, like, you know, sort of at least being conversant in knowing like, okay, you have a problem, and I think that like R or Python would solve that problem for you. Like, you don't necessarily have to be the one that writes that code, but I think at least sort of knowing what some of the tools are, so that you can make like an informed suggestion can be really helpful. So I would say my non-technical piece of advice would be, I guess, sort of like understanding or learning to see where there are gaps at an institution. When I talk to people about developing data services, one of the things that I think is important to realize is that what works at one institution may not be what works at another institution, because there are unique audiences that have different needs. So I think having that sort of sense of your institution and your environment is really important in sort of figuring out how do you make yourself most useful to your audience.
Awesome. That's really great advice, everyone, both on the technical side and on the more soft skill side. I do want to point out there have been a couple comments in the chat linking out to some really interesting looking resources. We have some links to teaching talks from the RStudio conference this year, one of which is about non-visual models for data science and data visualization. I'm definitely going to be watching that one. We also have a link to some work about data sonification from Patricia. Thank you for that, as well as some work about 3D printing for tactile map creation. And a tool for converting data visualizations to significations. Oh, and another one down here about tactile graphics. So I recommend that you click on all these and open them so you can take a look at them after our talk. We have a few more minutes. So what I want to do is pose a question that anyone can answer. Our speakers can answer, anyone in the chat can answer. I would like to think about the future a little bit. And I'm curious, what trends do you see emerging in data and open data specifically that you think will be shaping the conversation over the next few years? So what do you think we might be discussing if we held a similar panel next year? Where are we going? What do you think?
So I can start. So I think, and I talked about this a little bit in my talk yesterday. I think that we are kind of seeing a little bit of a shift in scientific communication as a result of everything that's gone on with COVID. You know, the advances that we've made and the speed with which we've been able to make them are very heavily reliant on the fact that, you know, the data is open, the publications are going out as preprints. So I think that I hope that some of that momentum will continue with science in general. I think, you know, sort of going along with that, there's the policy aspect of the NIH will be having a data management and sharing plan policy starting in January 2023. So I think that will also sort of help just basically like normalize open data, that this is not something that is, you know, an interesting choice that you decide to make as a researcher, and maybe you do it, maybe you don't. But that is just like the way that we do science, I hope, in going forward in the future.
Yeah, I think that Lisa's right. It certainly with the pandemic has pulled things into a sharper focus in this area. And I think we're seeing sort of concurrent conversation now about, well, how are you evaluating preprints, right? And if something is open, how are we really evaluating it to make sure we're not getting into misinformation space? I hope that next year this time we would also be having conversations about open infrastructure too, and about how we're maintaining these systems and making them as equitable as possible for everyone around the world to engage with, because the open access is just half of an equation, right? And it's problematic even there. But we really don't want to, we want to make sure that all doors are as open as possible for people to contribute into the space as well. And I think that's still a place for a lot of engagement.
Yeah, kind of feeding off of everything that's been said, I think definitely a direction that I mean, I'm hoping to see going, maybe this is the direction that we're going, is how do we have like public open scholarly discourse? Like, where do we take the, I mean, I've been seeing, I'm like on academic science Twitter, like many others, and I'm seeing a lot more and more people say like, okay, like peer review is just like going in a direction that's like hurting the way that we do create scholarship. And so how do we make this kind of process more open? How do we make it more inclusive? Who has a say, basically, is that question. Who has a say in what is legitimate scholarship? Is it only people at major institutions, or is it people across the world who have deep experience, but who have been under-acknowledged because they come from backgrounds that aren't appreciated by our current infrastructure? So I think that I really want, like, that's my hope. I don't know if that's where we're going to go, but I really hope that like researchers, the more they think about openness and like what does it mean to be a contributor to a scholarship, to think about like who has a say in like what is legitimate scholarship. I don't know. That's where I hope it's going.
Yeah, and with the work that we do, especially around civic data, you know, one thing that's going to just continue to be apparent is just like the dimensions around equity that we all have to address, and how can we do better with data to make it so that we can be more informed. But I think the other thing that open data has really helped make apparent, you know, especially around the pandemic, is just how broken and flawed all of the underlying, or many of the underlying systems are that we work with. And so thinking about kind of the infrastructure piece of it, so it's not just, oh, let's make data open, everything's good. It's more, okay, yeah, we see how bad things are, we see how flawed this data set is, but like, if we go upstream, how can we improve the infrastructure and the maintenance of all of this stuff that we're kind of like just taping together with duct tape? And you know, how do we think about this as a more systems problem?
I also want to share one of the comments in the chat. Someone said they think the future is really engaging research participants with the research results that they contributed to. I think that's a great comment and a great point to make. It really ties into the equity things that you folks have been talking about too. And Yasmeen shared a nice link in the chat related to Bob's comments, so check that one out as well. It looks like we're getting towards the top of the hour. If anyone has any further questions they'd like to ask, feel free. But otherwise, I'm going to start wrapping up. I learned so much today and throughout the week. Again, thank you so much to all of our panelists for joining in this Love Data Week party all week. I hope our audience members really got a lot out of it as well. I've really been starting to think about open data in new and different ways after listening to each one of your talks. They've been really thought-provoking. And of course, we also had some really great comments from the audience. So thank you to those who participated and shared your expertise and your links. This has really been a collaborative learning experience. If you would like to get in touch with any of our panelists to continue the conversation, you can find their contact information on their coffee chat slides, or just send me an email and I'll put you in touch. I'm going to put my email in the chat, and I'm also pasting the evaluation link in the chat box now. So again, if you missed that link, no worries, just send me an email and I will get that link to you. But really, thank you for joining us for Love Data Week. It's our first time doing this. I think it was really fun and really successful, and I hope all of you folks agreed as well, and that you all have a wonderful weekend.
It was great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Kelsey, and the rest of the NNLM staff for getting this organized. This has been great. Thanks.
And thanks everybody for tuning in too.
Yeah, I appreciate all the effort that's put in on the back end, and I'm just happy to be on a panel with y'all. Y'all do such amazing work. So this has been great. Thanks again for organizing and giving me the opportunity to be here.
Hey.